Welcome back. Today let's talk about three 7mm cartridges. We're going to talk about three that are all named by the Remington company, the 7mm-08, the 280, and the 7mm Remington Magnum. The history of the 7mm harks back all the way to the 7x57 Mauser, which is the parent case for the 3006, which was simply a lengthened version of that case, which basically is the case dimension for most of your very popular standard cartridges, whether it be the 243 Winchester, the 308, the 3006, 2506, 270, it goes on and on and on. Now, the 7mm Mauser never really caught, never caught fire here in America. Americans tended to have kind of a lukewarm response at best to metric designations, European designations, and the 7mm Mauser was notorious for having, shot at our troops at the turn of the century. Back when I say turn of the century, I'm talking turn of the 19th to the 20th century in the Spanish conflicts. Now, that kind of gives it a sour taste in people's mouths, and they really didn't pick up on it quickly. We were 30 caliber people. For the most part, we had the 30-40 Craig in those days, and then we progressed into the 30-06, and then finally the 308, and so it goes, and it's still kind of that way. We're very much a 30 caliber nation, with some exceptions to the rule. But the 7mm Mauser was lengthened probably by Wilhelm Brennecke. I'm sure saw that the 3006 case was a good size, good capacity case for our 3006, and so in 1917 he released the 7x64 Brennecke. 1917, we're in the middle of the First World War at the time. Now I'm not sure if Wilhelm Brennecke was trying to sell that to the German government in the midst of a war. That's probably a matter of historical interest, but in any case, the 7x64 Brennecke has remained extremely popular in Europe. 40 years later, in 1957, Remington introduced the 280 Remington, which is almost identical to the 7x64 Brennecke. Now, it was 40 years after the Brennecke was released and became popular in Europe, but all during this same time, starting in the 30s, in the early 30s, the 270 Winchester had become a very, very favorite plains game cartridge, long-range cartridge that was further popularized by the venerable Jack O'Connor, the late Jack O'Connor, who really was a strong proponent of the 270 for long-range shooting with a 130 grain bullet, which was advertised in those days at about 3140, 3142 feet per second, I think was the catalog velocity. I believe those velocities. It was always a flat shooter. It performed the way that it was written up. In recent years, I think perhaps it was throttled back a little bit because in some guns that might have, there were indications in some guns of some stickiness and things like that with factory cartridges. So I think it was throttled back a little bit by probably about 75 feet per second or so, just to make it a little bit more comfortable in some guns. But by the same token, that same 270 can, in many guns, handlers can find that they can get all of that and then some. So the 280 Remington, which was introduced in 1957, immediately was sailing into headwinds. It had the 270 Winchester that it was competing with directly. Now, I think it was probably a bonehead decision on the part of some boardroom members that decided to introduce the 280 with a 150 grain bullet. I'm sure that sounded pretty similar to a 150 grain loading in the 30-06, which was very popular, but that's not the right market. They were targeting, I think they were targeting the wrong market. It had nothing to do with the 30-06. It had to do with the 270. When you went to a sporting goods shop in the 60s, the dealer, you know, he would say, this is actually a better ballistic performer, and he'd be showing you a 280. And so you'd say, well, what's the velocity of this? And he'd flip open the sales book, and he'd show you, oh, it's running at 2790. Oh, cool. Well, my friend's 270 is running at 3140. You know, I'll take a pass on that. Thank you very much. Notwithstanding the fact that, you know, ballistically it had a better shaped bullet. It was a longer, more streamlined bullet, better ballistic coefficient, better sectional density, and all that stuff. It was running at old 30-06 numbers, you know, like M1 Garand numbers. And it just didn't look very appealing. So, you know, it cruised along really without any solid interest, and it was also introduced in the 760 and the 740 pump and automatic, and it was introduced in the 721 Remington. Three guns which were just, you know, people who shoot long range are not interested in autos and pumps. They're bolt action people. That's what, you know, Westerners are bolt action people. They're shooting at long range. Not too many people are shooting pumps and autos in that part of the country. So that became another nail in his coffin, I think, for quite a long time. Around about the late 70s, around about 1978 or something like that, Remington decided to upgrade its performance, and they pushed up the performance by a good solid 100 feet per second, and they relabeled it the 7mm Remington Express. And then the bottom of the drawer fell open, because now people were getting confused with it, and they were confusing it with the 7mm Remington Magnum. They didn't know which was what. Nobody explained to them. I remember the big centerfold ads that they had in Sportsfield and all that stuff, which, you know, advertised this new 7mm Remington Express. And people just didn't get it. They didn't realize it was the same exact chambering, just with a different label on it. So 2 years later or so, about 1981, Remington basically canned that idea, and they went back to its original name as a 280. Probably people thought that they also throttled it back, which they didn't. It remained the hotter, newer 280, which had about 100 foot per second better velocity. But you know, when you have problems naming cartridges like that, it's kind of like when they had to rename their 244 Remington to the 6mm Remington because they had the wrong twist dimensions in it for the 100 grain bullets. You know, that's the same sort of thing. It seemed like the Remington boardroom must have been run by a bunch of nitwits that just couldn't seem to get the marketing straight. Having said all that, speaking strictly as a person who likes guns and likes to shoot at long range and things like that, the 280 Remington is fabulous performer. It's a wonderful performer. With the right loads, it will match the trajectory of the 270 Winchester, but it will do it with a heavier bullet. So, as I've explained in the past, where the 140 grain 7mm bullet is essentially the big brother to the 130 grain 270 bullet. So if you're driving the same bullet ballistic coefficient, it's the ballistic coefficient that penetrates the atmosphere. So if you have two bullets of different diameter, but both with the same ballistic coefficient, they're going to fly exactly the same distance through exactly the same trajectory if they're starting out at the same speed. So that's true. You can take now. You can buy 140 grain 280 loads that start out with roughly the same velocity as a 270 Winchester, depending on from whom you purchase it. You know, every company has its own loadings, and more than anything else, it's always a matter of accuracy to me. If I'd rather have a load that's a little bit slower but more accurate over one that's just simply more speedy. It's always about hitting the target. But the 280, that's the history of the 280. Basically, you've got a 30-06 cartridge case, which has been necked down, or you can say it was a copy of the 7x64 Brennecke, whichever way you want to approach it. But it's an extremely accurate, long-range performer that hits a little bit harder on target than the 270. Now I have to be a little bit pragmatic. You know, I'm only speaking now as a pragmatist, as a person who has had practical experience. And I think that this has probably been the difficulty with the 280 through the years in marketing, is that the 270, as I mentioned in my video about that cartridge, the 270 works. So the problem is that you need to have a bigger, you know, it works on the targets that it's generally purchased for. It's generally purchased for pronghorns, long-range shooting at coyotes, long-range shooting at mule deer, and occasionally moderate-range shooting at elk. So, excepting the larger game species like the elk, you know, you really don't need to have more than a 130 grain bullet. You really don't need that 140 grain bullet, even if it is traveling at the same speed, and even if it is hitting with greater energy, because the bullet, either one, is passing right on through, virtually from any angle. So that becomes, as they say in the courtroom, moot. We don't have too much of a selection, and you know, America has, the vote has been out for many, many years, and since 1957 the 280 has had a difficult time. Couple that now with when the 280 came back out in its new, I should say its new old skin. It's the old wrapper, but with a different velocity, higher velocity, that was running still roundabout, you know, in the low 29s, high 28s, with a 150 grain bullet. And that was the one that was still, you know, so much ammo was sold with 150 grain bullets, which I still say was not the right. That was not the right cartridge for that sales maneuver. When you're competing against the 270, you needed to have something that competed with the 270, not something that competed with the 30-06. So the 7mm-08 came along in the early 80s. I think it was about 1982, 1981, which is the same time that they went back to the 280 designation on the head stamp with the original 280 and changed back from the 7mm Express. So, you know, this was a double whammy against the 280. People were suffering from a lot of confusion, and you know, why are you doing this? They didn't understand what the naming process was with the 280. Now you come along with the 7mm-08, which really was a highly desirable cartridge for a lot of people because it filled an important niche. It started out as a metallic silhouette cartridge, as a Wildcat down in you know, silhouette matches in Mexico. That's where it got its first you know, upbringing, and it had become very popular, and that's where Remington finally adopted it as it was a Wildcat that they adopted as a commercial cartridge, virtually with the same chambering that was popular at the time. And it's nothing more than a 308 case, neck down to 7mm. Now you see a pattern here. We got the 280, which is a neck down version of the 30-06 case, and you got the 7mm-08, which is a neck down version of the 308 case. One would logically assume, physics being what they are, that you know they're basically going to be the same thing, but just at a different energy level. All things being equal, pretty much the same. You're talking about the same speed for the 308 case as you are with the 7mm-08 case. You're talking about the same speed with the 30-06 as you are with the 280. It's all about the same thing, give or take a few feet per second, and give or take a few yards. There's really, you know, you can stack them all up and you can shoot them all out there at the same target, and they're all going to arrive pretty much doing the same thing. What's the difference? The difference is essentially there's two things. There's the recoil and there's the frontal area. Naturally, a 30 caliber bullet has got a larger frontal area than a 7mm bullet. Not by much. You know, you're talking very little, 284 versus 308. So it's a difference in diameter, which is meaningful, however, on game. Whether it's meaningful enough to make any difference is again, it's generally a moot point. I don't think that there isn't any difference whatsoever in performance on deer-sized game. Deer-sized game, you've already killed them when you got beyond 6mm. That's, you know, with that any kind of bullet at that speed, 2,900 feet per second, at 6mm, you already got a dead deer. So as you go up in size, it's really, you know, irrelevant in terms of deer hunting. It can have some meaning when it comes to, you know, bucking wind at long range, I suppose, and things like that. And you know, it certainly has significance when you climb up in terms of larger game, when you get up into elk-sized game. So this is where you are with those two cartridges, with the 7mm-08 and the 280. The difference in actual velocity runs around just barely 100-150 feet per second, depending on, you know, the brand of ammo and the bullet shape. There's so many different bullet shapes. You know, you get very pointed profiles, and you got you know, you've got less pointed me-plats, which is maybe a flat, like the PowerPoint Winchester bullet has got a flatter me-plat. You can have different bullet shapes at the base, which give better or worse drag coefficient. So your boat tails, the ballistic tips have got a small boat tail. All those things contribute to ballistics. So sometimes when you compare cartridges, you got to be careful that you're comparing apples to apples and not apples to oranges, because you're comparing sometimes the same company will not offer the same ballistic shapes from one cartridge to another. So you've got to beware of that. And sometimes, even though they're the same ballistic shape, sometimes the ogives are not exactly the same. So there are differences. In other words, the ogive being the curvature of the bullet. You know, longer, more slender ogives, like max bullets, are more efficient than the more pronounced and rounded ones that are used commonly in hunting bullets. So you're talking about roughly between the 7mm-08 and the 280 with similar bullet weights. You're talking generally a difference of about 25 to 30 yards. Now, as I mentioned, I want you to watch the video on the 330 caliber cartridges, on the 308, the 30-06, and the 300 Winchester Magnum, because those are the same sizes as we go up in the 7mm. So I don't want to cover the same ground again. But if you watch that video, you'll understand basically how the velocity thing works as it goes up the scale. You can generally say that for every 100 feet per second, with the same bullet shape and the same, you know, the same bore diameter, that 100 feet per second will generally give you around 20 to 25 yards of additional range. All things regarding that range, both in the trajectory and in the velocity and energy. Basically, if you're lagging behind for 100 feet per second, you're lagging behind about 25 or less yards. And so, you know, it generally takes about 400 feet per second to gain 100 yards. In other words, that's about how it works. So you know, if you look at the old 7x57 Mauser, which, you know, back in the old days, I've got a book here from 1941 that was written by Jack O'Connor. Back in 1941, the 7x57 Mauser was at that time with a 139 grain bullet, which same as a 140 grain bullet, was traveling at 2,900 feet per second. Well, that's almost 500 feet per second behind the hottest loadings that I've found in the 7mm Remington Magnum. That gains you, the 7mm Remington Magnum, for all that 500 yards, basically gets about 115 or so yards additional range. That's why the 7x57 Mauser, as far as I'm concerned, was one of the most important discoveries ballistically that was ever made. Now, what I said in the other video with regard to the 30 calibers, length of the case becomes important when you get into the longer bullets. That's where the 280 has a significant advantage over the 7x57, I should say the 7mm-08. The longer case allows it to handle longer, heavier bullets. The 7mm-08 is essentially a 140 grain, maybe 150 grain bullet case. Some people have loaded it with 160 grain bullets. It's crowding the case. You're starting to get deep inside that case, and you're taking up a little bit of powder chamber. You know, you have to use more of the slower burning powders, which, you know, whenever you're adding slower and more powder, you're adding more recoil. So it's always preferable to have a more roomy case that can be filled up easily than to have a case that's crowded and cramped, where the powder has to be compacted by the base of the bullet. We'll quickly move into the 7mm Remington Magnum. This is probably, if you look at the raw ballistic figures, you know, now I printed these off of the Winchester ballistic chart. I got this. This is their data, and I also have one here as a screenshot from the Remington page for their ballistic data. So this is from the Winchester Ballistic Calculator, which is that's a nice site to go visit. You can compare factory loads. The thing that's rather curious is that I've got to put on my spectacles here. I've had cataract surgery a couple of months ago, so it's a fabulous thing. Now I can go back to shooting and see practically as I used to see when I was a youngster. Not quite, but I still need them to read. So anyway, now the 7mm Remington Magnum with a 140 grain bullet with a Remington load is 31.75 at the muzzle. Winchester lists that same load. You can go brain dead reading these things, you know. So I don't recommend it. 7mm Remington Magnum, 140 grain Supreme ballistic silver tip bullet, 3,100 feet per second. Now there's a funny thing, huh? You wonder, Remington, which is the founder of the cartridge, they're getting 31.75, and Winchester is 3,100. Not surprised. You've got, you know, Winchester and Remington have always been competitors. They've been arch rivals. So Winchester perhaps is going to throttle it back a little bit so that it doesn't compete strongly against what? The 270. So that 3,100 feet per second, remember, it's all about velocity, so they'll keep that 3,100 feet per second. That doesn't quite come up to the 3,140 that everybody knows was the old velocity for the 270. That's at least my theory. The other thing that you have here, now that's with the Remington Magnum. The other thing that you have here now is the 7mm-08, which is cruising along at 2860. How much different is that than the 280, which is running the same bullet, 140 grain bullet, at 3,000? So you remember I spoke about basically 25 yards, 20 to 25 yards for each 100 foot per second of change. So you go from 2860 to 3,000. You're talking 140 feet per second. 140 feet per second. You're talking somewhere around 50 yards or less. So it's the difference is not significant. If you go to Winchester's figure, Winchester has a 7mm-08 load, say that 10 times. and their 7mm-08 load runs at 2770. I know for a fact that that is a low velocity for the 7mm-08, and again, perhaps Remington will pump it out a little bit quicker. Let's see. Remington, which is the founder of that cartridge, pumps it out at 2860. So again, you know, I think that Winchester may be lowballing the Remington stuff, and I'm sure Remington lowballs the Winchester stuff. That might be the case. I don't want to make accusations because I don't know if that's actually the case or not. But it just seems curious that in this day and age, where you know everybody knows what the other guy is doing in the competitive arena, and it just stands to reason that somebody's trying to protect their own case. And there is a lot of protective marketing going on there. I think the very simple fact of the matter is that the 7mm Remington Magnum in factory loadings is probably close to 200 feet per second below what its potential is. Its potential is exactly the same as the 300 Winchester Magnum in terms of velocity, and even the 300 Winchester Magnum is not traveling at full velocity potential. Let me see if I can find that. So we've got a 160 grain 7mm Remington Magnum. The 7mm Remington Magnum, its greatest potential is with the heavier bullets. You really, you know, to buy a 7mm Remington Magnum and use it with 140 grain bullets, I was simply comparing, you know, apples to apples here, but that's not the correct bullet for that particular cartridge. That cartridge is going to waste, you know, you're wasting an awful lot of recoil, you're wasting a lot of muzzle blast, and all the other raw materials when you're trying to drive a 140 grain bullet at those speeds, because the 140 grain bullet out of the 280 and even out of the 7mm-08 has already gotten the job done. At those velocities, at the velocities that I'm speaking about, well into the 30s, you've got a lot of tissue destruction. That's why it's wiser with the Magnum cartridges to keep the bullet weight up. So with the 300 Winchester Magnum, generally speaking, you want to keep the bullet weight above 180 grains, and with the 7mm Remington Magnum, you want to keep it above 160 grains, at 160 or above. That throttles down the velocity a little bit and keeps it from being overly destructive. They're still long-range performers, believe me. These things are still getting out there to 450 plus yards, 500 yards. There's no trouble whatsoever. I don't recommend shooting at those distances because, you know, you can't even see game at those distances. I've been out there. It's very, very difficult to even see game. You know, elk, as big as they are, they just don't look that, they're not that discernible at that distance in some terrain that they're found. They're certainly not found in the timbers at that range. But see, the 160 grain loading is listed at 2950 from Winchester, and that compares to exactly 180 grain Winchester Magnum at 2950. Exactly the same speed, and you know, the energy is different by 470, basically 400 foot-pounds of energy, which is meaningful when you're talking about getting through heavy bone on an elk. So, you know, you really have to toss it up. If you're a person who's shy to recoil, the 7mm Remington Magnum with a 160 grain bullet makes a lot more sense than a 180 grain bullet out of a 300 Winchester Magnum. That 400 foot-pounds of energy means absolutely nothing if you're not hitting the game where you want to. It's always best to have the lighter recoil. The difference in recoil, as I mentioned in a recent video, you're talking like 31 foot-pounds of free recoil with the 300 Winchester Magnum with that 180 grain loading, and with the 160 grain loading with the 7mm Remington Magnum, you're talking more like 23. You know, that's a big difference. That's a huge difference in terms of felt free recoil. Now, I just want to kind of go back over this again. If you're a woods hunter and if you have a 7mm bore that with a 7mm-08, that's an ideal cartridge for woodland shooting. Low recoil, you're reducing the recoil down by about 7 or 8 foot-pounds of recoil with similar loadings. The trajectory is virtually the same as a 150 grain 308 cartridge. They're almost identical. The 280 gets you a little bit it's a strong long-range performer, especially on heavier game. The difference between the 280 Remington and the 7mm Remington Magnum is about exactly the same difference as the 30-06 to the 300 Winchester Magnum. The difference in spread is roughly 300. The potential for 300 feet per second, which will get you around about 75 yards or more of range with the 7mm Remington Magnum with equal bullet sizes. That 280 is extremely efficient. It's probably one of the most efficient cartridges out there. All the 30-06 size cases are extremely efficient. The government had it right when they copied the 7x57 Mauser and they turned it into the 30-06. They had it right. The numbers were right to begin with. The capacity of that case does a very efficient job. So I'm highly in favor of the Magnum cases for, absolutely nothing to do with deer whatsoever. I'm not in favor of Magnum cases for deer. They simply are far too destructive. I am in favor of those Magnum cases, the 7mm and the 30 caliber, the 300 Winchester Magnum for elk-sized game. And all things considered, if you're wondering whether you want to get the 7mm Remington Magnum or the 300 Winchester Magnum, you have to consider the same thing as a person getting the 280 versus the 270 or the 30-06 or the 308 versus the 7mm-08. You have to consider what it is that you're using it for. Frontal area is of no concern for deer, so I would always say choose the lightest cartridge that you can get away with for the range that you're hunting. The 308 and the 7mm-08, they're solid 325 yard performers. That's what they are. They're just very, very good out to 325 yards. The 280 is very, very efficient out to 425, even 450 yards. The 7mm Remington Magnum will get you out to 400, another 75 to 100 yards. So if you can efficiently and accurately handle the larger bore diameters with the increased recoil and all the things that attend to it, then that's fine. But always remember that as you go up just a few grains of powder and 10 grains of bullet weight, the recoil energy soars. It really does. It applies another significant amount of recoil to your shoulder. The 7mm make an awful lot of sense for the person who's outfitting his youngster for the first time with a deer rifle. 7mm-08 load can be had with reduced light loading. I think they're too light, as a matter of fact, but they can be had with reduced loadings. The 7mm-08 is available with a light charge at 2360. I would prefer it was up another 100 feet per second or so. I think it would be more than soft enough for most youngsters. But they do have a light factory loading for it. But if you're a hand loader, you can also do the same thing and you can tailor it to your own needs. The 7mm Remington Magnum is also available with light loadings, which are very, 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 if you've got a 140 grain bullet, the light loading is 2710. That makes a superb woodland load. As a matter of fact, that's almost a dead ringer for the 7x57 Mauser. So you can, there's something to be said for that. You can have a 7mm Remington Magnum that you can use as an all-purpose gun for the woodlands, for shooting at At closer ranges out to 300 yards at 2,700 feet per second, and believe me, that's one of the most popular cartridges that ever hit the planet, was the 7x57 Mauser, and that's a ringer for it. So you can always have that load, which will shoot at 2,700 feet per second for closer range shooting on deer-sized game, and then you can boost it with the standard factory loading for use on elk and things like that. I think that pretty much covers it all. Again, to get more in depth about the design of the cartridges and how that works out, visit my video on the three 30 caliber cartridges, the 308 and the 3006 and the 300 Winchester Magnum. These are a 7mm version of the same thing, just a little bit lighter recoil, a little bit lighter in the energy, a little bit less frontal area. So that's both good and bad. If you don't want to have as much meat destruction, 7mm will do the job. And if you want to have more tissue destruction for elk and things like that, the 30 caliber will maybe fill the bill more. And then you have to size it to the person. Whether most women can handle a 7mm-08. Some women can handle a 280. Most women can handle a 270, and that's where the big selection goes. If you're looking for a long range plains game cartridge for a woman, it's a toss up between the 7mm-08 and the slightly longer range 270, which is really out there. And then the very few women, but some women can handle the 7mm Remington Magnum. I don't know of any women that can handle the, I've never met a woman that can handle the 300 Winchester Magnum. That's a tough cartridge for, you're talking over 30 pounds of free recoil. So anyway, but those are all the things that you can consider when you're shopping around. Enjoy your shooting, shoot as often as you can and safely. God bless.